Well, here at the lab, like I'd mentioned, we have a diverse group of individuals that are working together. We're trying to do as much as we can to better understand how these animals are being impacted. So we've got parasitologists, toxicologists, microbiologists that are working pretty much with various researchers, trying to get more holistic approach of how these different groups are being impacted, as well as we've all got colleagues in Louisiana, in Alabama, in Florida, as well as beyond, that are helping with expertise to better understand the current situation.
Okay.
Well, at this point, since a lot of my research focuses on sharks, in most ecosystems, sharks are going to be sort of what we consider apex predators or top predators, and so they're playing a critical role within the ecosystem and keeping sort of the other organisms' population numbers at bay. And so the big concern is how are these animals being impacted? And so it can happen in numerous ways. They could be directly impacted by encountering the oil, or if they feed on any animals that have succumbed to the oil, that indirectly they'll be ingesting the oil that way. And so at this point, we haven't really seen any major impacts that we are aware of at this point. We've been sampling for, at least in the coastal areas, weekly since the storm began. And we haven't seen any really redistribution. There's been talk of sharks and other species that are moving closer to shore, offshore species that are coming inshore, potentially as a result of the oil spill, and we're just not seeing that. And one of the big concerns, talking with people that are conducting aerial surveys, the basic understanding that we've come to now is that the animals are not detecting the oil. They're under the sheen, they're on the edge of the oil. If the oil was such a noxious signal, these animals would stay away, and that's not happening. And so now there's dead zones that are occurring potentially as a result of oil, which may redistribute some animals, but the oil itself, I don't think there's much evidence suggesting that it will redistribute the animals. And that's a big concern with one of the species we work with, which is the whale shark. And so these animals are the largest fish in the ocean. They can reach up to 50 feet long. And they spend a lot of their time at the surface filter feeding on planktonic organisms, fish eggs, plankton, as well as small fish and jellyfish. And our concern is that the area of the oil spill is in prime feeding habitat. We've been collecting sightings data for the past 5 years, and a third of our sightings are in the area of the oil spill. And so we know they're going to show up into this area to feed during this time. And we were hoping that they would be able to pick up the oil and be deterred, but that's not happening. There's been several reports now and photos of animals actually surrounded by thick oil at the surface feeding. So what happens is, if these animals ingest the oil, which is most likely happening at some level, the oil is going to coat their gills and they're going to suffocate. And most sharks, or all sharks, are negatively buoyant, so these animals are then going to sink to the bottom. There's really going to be no evidence. Unlike your turtles, your marine mammals, and your birds, they're not going to float, so it's going to be really hard to assess how many animals have been impacted by the oil. And that's a big concern we have, because it's sort of a little treasure here in the northern Gulf of Mexico that we have these animals, and relatively a large population, and at this point we don't know how many animals have been impacted by this oil.
What's the forecast out?
Well, right now everything's been sort of looking for the acute effect. And so the acute effect, most likely it primarily affects individuals, and most likely what you see is if there's an acute effect, it's usually death. We're now sort of transitioning over to what we consider chronic or long-term effects, and they usually affect populations. And so some of the things that we're really concerned with, at least with some of our coastal shark populations, as well as some of the other organisms, is such things like immunosuppression due to chronic exposure to oil, dispersed oil, those type of compounds, as well as endocrine disruption. The oil does have chemicals in there that mimic estrogen, and for these animals to be exposed to that, it has a tremendous impact or effect on the reproductive system. Right now these animals have a pretty tight network of hormones and reproductive properties that once these chemicals get exposed to these animals, it's going to sort of disrupt this, and we're going to start looking for things like infertility, skewed sex ratios, feminization of the males. All these things can have tremendous impacts on future generations. Well, I think there's a few things that basically everybody's been talking about lately. The first thing is the well has been capped for maybe 3 weeks now, and there's been this talk of it's really tough trying to find oil now. Where's the oil gone? There's been several reports that are discussing how much oil has been dispersed, how much has been broken down by bacteria. But depending on what side of the fence you're on, anywhere between maybe 30 to 50% is still out there, which is a significant amount of oil. And there's this idea that there's submerged oil still out there somewhere. I know there's lots of scientists out there trying to track this down, and it may not be, we may not know the extent of it until it starts washing up somewhere, and that's sort of the unknown aspect of this. Where is this oil? It can't, once you cap it, it couldn't have gone away. And so, and hopefully the microbiologists will get a better understanding of how well the bacteria here in the northern Gulf with the increased temperatures is actually breaking down the oil. And then of course that's been a big question from the get-go. And I think right now, I think most people are saying that it's done a lot better job than we've ever thought of. But I think there's still a tremendous amount of impact that can occur out there, and I think that people need to know that there's still lots of oil out there, and just because we can't spot it from the air doesn't mean that it's not impacting the ecosystem. So one of our major concerns since the spill began is how these inshore shark nursery areas have been impacted. We've got this critical area where these guys spend the first few years of their lives, and if this is being impacted, this is going to have tremendous impact on the populations in the Gulf of Mexico. And so we've been looking, we've basically been sampling since the spill began weekly, and we've been looking for certain things. We've been taking weekly toxicological samples, looking at potential oil exposure. We've been looking at stomach contents, trying to see if these guys are ingesting any organisms that may have succumbed to the oil. And basically what we're seeing is, or as well as, are we seeing animals that really shouldn't be here, offshore species that don't normally occur in the inshore area. And as of right now, we really haven't seen a lot of that. What we've mainly seen is a lot of what we call dead zones or low oxygen environments, which can be the result of freshwater influence as well as potentially dispersed oil that the bacteria are breaking up. And so we haven't been able to distinguish whether it's the freshwater or that. But other than that, I mean, everything seems to be that the numbers seem to be really good. Our abundance indices are looking really good, and we're not seeing anything unusual at this point. But as time continues, we're going to continue to look at this for years to come. Okay, so in most marine environments, marine ecosystems, sharks play a pretty high role in the environment. They're typically apex, what we call top predators. And so they're basically, their role is to keep other populations in check. And so one of the concerns is if there are contaminants within the food web or within the food chain, that this will be bioaccumulated in sharks. Now, one of the big chemicals that everybody's looking for are what they call PAHs, and these within vertebrates are metabolized very quickly, and so that's not something that we'd anticipate seeing within the sharks, but we are taking a lot of toxicological samples to see if there is a heavy load, at least in the liver and some other tissues, that may retain some of this. But yeah, if there are impacts in the ecosystem, you would think, because sharks are top predators, that they would be showing some of these impacts. So I've been studying sharks here at the Gulf Coast Research Lab for about 10, 11 years now, and with the development of this new oil spill, and it's not really a spill, I guess an oil leak, it's really changed our focus on our research. And we're now really focused on what are the potential impacts, and not only short-term but also long-term. And I've got a feeling that not only for me, but many of the scientists here along the coast, this is sort of going to change our careers. That we're going to be spending a lot of time over the next few decades looking at and focusing on the impacts from this leak in this region.